how similar are AI minds to humans? Like, where do you notice overlap and where do you notice very different kind of mechanisms?
They're completely dissimilar. They hardly have anything to do with one another. We call both of them neural networks, but in the case of humans, these are neural networks with a lot of reentrant loops. In the case of AI and transformers, these are almost exclusively feed-forward neural networks. So there is very little relation between the two. But of course, what matters at the end is what they do. Whether AI reasons like humans or not, it's almost unimportant. It's even unimportant whether the word reasoning is actually applicable because it makes an analogy with the way humans process information. What matters is the result. Do you get results that are useful, that are correct? And from that perspective, I'm very comfortable doing AI and calling it AI, even though it has nothing to do with human minds, or very little.
Hmm. Okay, so reasoning doesn't have to be associated with outcome. I always assumed they were kind of similar words. How do you define reasoning?
Reasoning is the effective processing of data to arriving at effective conclusions. And what steps you follow to get to those conclusions is less relevant than getting at the right conclusions and causing the right actions in the world in order to solve our problems or to answer our questions, right? We humans reason in a very specific way. It is doubtful whether other higher-minded animals like pachyderms and even some mollusks like octopuses, whether they think in any way analogous to ours. I don't think AI is analogous to us. We call it a neural network because of a very, very high level abstract analogy with the networks of neurons in our brains, but the structure is very different.
Wow, that's a really interesting thought. I guess, yeah, even a super complicated lookup table, if it gets you to the right answer, even without reasoning, it's still the right answer and it's intelligence, I
Yes.
suppose.
We think symbolically, right? We replace elements of the world with internal cognitive symbols, like words or caricatural pictures that play the role of that element in the world within our minds. I don't think modern transformers reason that way. I think we have every reason to believe that they do not reason symbolically. But the latest results of Gemini 3 and some of the latest models indicate, I think, very strongly that there are emergent pattern matching networks within a transformer that have the end effect of reasoning. Even if they don't use symbolic reasoning, the end effect is similar. And since we don't really understand how these ginormous networks are working in modern transformers, there's plenty of room there for different patterns of information flow that we do not understand and we do not recognize in ourselves, but which nonetheless lead systematically to the correct conclusions and the correct actions. To me, that's what matters at the end.
Yeah. So tell me about the chances of us predicting any of these emergent properties, especially if it's not being done through reasoning. Is there hope that we can predict these ahead of time?
I don't think so. No, these are emerging properties of an extremely high dimensional system. I don't think we can wrap our heads around it. We have to monitor inputs and outputs and put safeguards in place, but to predict what will happen, I think that is very difficult. And in a sense, this is how it should be. We don't even understand how our own neural networks actually work inside our brains. If you look at neuroimaging, cognitive neuroscience today, the level of understanding we have is very, very coarse. We know roughly which areas of the brain tend to light up. We know roughly which kinds of activity are associated with conscious experience, but we don't really know down to the lower levels what is going on, how we get to the actions and thoughts and emotions and conclusions that we get to. We can predict some very rough patterns, but we don't really understand the fine mechanisms involved. So if a transformer is to have a cognitive performance equivalent to ours, it stands to reason that we shouldn't be able to understand that either.
And I guess we can't make any assumptions that whatever these emergent properties are going to be in our best interest.
We cannot make those assumptions. I think we have to put controls in place, hardware-enabled mechanisms in place that are not software hackable. Look, AI is dangerous. So is a nuclear power plant. Technology that is very powerful is very dangerous, but it is not a autonomous, independent beast that we cannot control. We can put guardrails, safeguards around it and control the scope of its possible actions, just like we do with a nuclear power plant. I think that's how we should regard the problem. And AI is an extremely powerful tool, so powerful that we don't quite understand everything that is going on. We also do not understand what's going on within a quark. We know there are 3 within a proton, but we do not understand really what's happening within that proton, how those quarks are interacting with one another. It's a universe of complexity there. Yet, we have nuclear power plants, and they do what we want them to do, and we have safeguards in place. And yes, a couple have gone wrong. We've learned a thing or two now, and I personally think modern nuclear power plants are sufficiently safe that I would live next door to one of them, rather one of them than a coal-burning power station.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, well, that gives me some hope to rest on. Maybe we could talk about consciousness. It's since we were talking about how you really can't see much more in the human brain except the coarse grain kind of understanding of what parts are sort of lighting up at certain times. What does it mean if consciousness is fundamental? Like, what does that phrase mean? I hear it a lot.
It means it's the only thing that truly exists. Only mental states exist in nature. Everything else that we consider to be non-mental is an abstraction of our mental state. So when we speak of matter as being non-mental, it's a conceptual abstraction of our mental states because we never access matter outside mentation. All we ever have is mentation. We are cooped up in mentation, and we think we escape from mentation because we abstract theoretically. But these theoretical abstractions are just that in principle. They are just theoretical abstractions, not empirical elements of the world. So under analytic idealism, you would say all natural states are mental, but that doesn't mean that nature exists in your mind. Just as my thoughts are mental and they don't exist in your mind. There is mentation beyond your mind. My thoughts are an example of that. So analytic idealism just extrapolates that further and says, all the world beyond your mind, it's also mental. They are not your mental states, yours, but they are mental too, just like my thoughts are not your mental states, but they are mental too. And what we call matter is the external appearance of mental states. It's what mental states look like when they are observed from the outside as opposed to experienced from a first-person perspective. So my brain, the matter of my brain, is what my conscious inner life looks like from the outside. The same about the matter in your brain. And since the atoms and fields that compose your nervous system and mine are the same kinds of atoms and force fields that compose the rest of the universe, then the rest of the universe too is how the mentation of nature looks like from our perspective. That's the core idea.
Wow, that's so interesting. So, okay, can you walk me through like maybe an everyday experience? Like, if I'm like holding a cup of coffee and it feels so solid and I'm thinking about it and I'm feeling the sensation of the taste, do you feel like that's just not real except for on this kind of highest abstracted layer?
Oh no, it is real. It is real as experience. The concreteness of your cup of coffee is an experience. The solidity of it is an experience. The warmth you feel in your fingers and your tongue is an experience, very concrete. The only thing that is concrete in nature is experience. Everything else is abstraction. So your cup of coffee is real as an experience. Where we go wrong is that we abstract that behind or related to the experience in some way, there is something non-experiential. So I'm not saying that your cup of coffee exists only insofar as your experience is concerned. I'm not saying that. If you set your cup of coffee on your kitchen counter and you go to bed, next day you wake up, you come down, and it's still there. It seems to have survived the fact that you fell asleep. So that cup of coffee is made of real mental states out there in the world that are not under your control and do not care whether you are around to observe them or not. But it is mental states that when you interact with, appear to you as the cup of coffee. Now, this may sound counterintuitive for the cup of coffee, but think of another object, a human nervous system, a human brain. That is also an object you can hold in your hands. Presumably, you can taste it, you can lick it, you feel the warmth and the humidity of it, you feel the squishiness of it, it has a certain weight, it occupies space. I mean, it's extremely concrete, a human brain. And yet, you know that from a first-person perspective, through direct acquaintance, your human brain is your conscious inner life. Your human brain, from its own perspective, is your thoughts, your emotions, your perceptions of the world from the particular perspective you occupy, and so on, everything that you have ever known. But from the outside, it looks like a brain. In both cases, these are experiential states. Your inner life is a set of experiential states. The brain, perceivable by another person, is a set of experiential states. They are different experiential states, but they are both sets of experiential states. There is never, ever anything non-experiential involved in this, insofar as empirical evidence allows us to conclude.
Okay, that's so fascinating. So, what is so my first what I want to say, and I know this question's kind of wrong in a way, so we'll talk about that too. But like what I want to say is that if I go to sleep and the coffee is still sitting here in the morning, then whose mental state is keeping the coffee there? But also, I'm sure asking whose mental state is sort of where the problem is. So, like, why do I have that instinct to say whose mental state is keeping the coffee there? And then what's a better explanation or a better question that kind of gets at that truth?
Because we are used to associating minds with biology. And biology is circumscribed in space. And the mental states of biology from a first-person perspective are integrated mental states. Here I'm alluding to integrated information theory. In other words, the information associated with those mental states is sort of locked in reentrant loops. It forms a cluster that feeds itself and separates it from the rest of the world. This is IIT, Integrated Information Theory. That's why we seem to be separate from the rest of nature, because we integrate that information along the lines of the brain's anatomy in the form of all kinds of reentrant loops, so that information is reinforced and circulates within this locus of space-time that your brain occupies. So we feel separate because of this integration of information around that center, forming a complex that we call the ego. But there can be, also in us, but in nature at large, mental states that are not integrated in this way. Mental states that are loose. Giulio Tononi, the creator of integrated information theory, calls it ontological dust. But we only have access to this highly integrated mode of mentation. It's all we know because that's what we are. So we associate mentation with that. And that's why we ask, if there are mental states out there, whose mental states are those? And the answer is no one's. These are mental states out there in nature. They don't integrate and form these reentrant loops or clusters of integrated information that gives you and I our sense of individual identity. You could compare it to delirium states, and a sequence of loose, disconnected mental states. Now, if you really want the answer, whose mental states are they? The states that form the inanimate world out there? Well, they're nature's mental states. That's the only answer you could come up with. But we shouldn't anthropomorphize them. We shouldn't think of the subjectivity behind those mental states as having a coherent, a sustained sense of individual identity separate from the world. They don't have it. There isn't enough integrated information for them to develop this. It's just experiential state. There is subjectivity, but not clustered, differentiated, individual subjectivity.
Man, I just find this stuff so interesting. Okay, so do I have to think lower level than an atom, or can I say that as long as something is sufficiently complex as a system and it has some kind of looping pattern, whatever integrated integration theory like posits, then it can create a mental state? Or do we have to go? Am I still thinking too high with like actual atoms coming together?
Integrated information theory today does not discriminate. So whatever information can be integrated, the modeling applies. You can model um, how complexes, mental complexes emerge. Um, my own philosophical view, analytic idealism, tries to look at sustained dissociative boundaries across different sets of mental states. Life is a sustained dissociative boundary between the mental states in me and the mental states of the world. The way to maintain this differentiation between me and the world is to maintain my life. It's to eat, it's to breathe, to burn energy, to perform metabolism, to have an immune system. So life is a sort of a active maintenance mechanism of a dissociative boundary between my mental states and the states of nature. And when we ask, is someone conscious or is something conscious? What we are actually asking is not only are there mental states underlying that something that we are asking, whether it's conscious or not. We are actually asking, does that something have a private inner life of its own, separate from the world? And under analytic idealism, life is what does that. Metabolism is the mechanism of maintaining this privateness aspect of a conscious inner life. Creates a boundary, sort of a Markov blanket between the inside and the outside. So I have the tendency to answer the question, is something conscious, with another question, is it alive? If it is alive, then it is conscious in the sense that you and I are. But IIT would say, everything is related to mental states. Everything is related to conscious states. The only question is, how integrated are they? Do they form a cluster that has a sort of a differentiated sense of identity, or do they not? And so far, almost everything we've looked at does not form anywhere near the level of integrated information that you and I have. Not even a transformer. A transformer is mostly a feed-forward network. It doesn't have all these reentrant loops that we can see in brain anatomy. So a transformer is not conscious in the sense that it does not have a conscious inner life of its own, separate from the rest of the world. It is made of mental states, just like my water bottle here. Somebody who is only listening, this is my water bottle. It's made of mental states, but there is nothing it is like to be the water bottle in and of itself. Just as there is nothing it is like to be a specific individual neuron in my brain. The mental states underlying that neuron are subsumed in my unitary conscious inner life. So that is the question we are asking. When we ask, is an AI conscious? People think, well, Bernardo Kastrup would say it is, because Bernardo Kastrup says everything is made of mental states. And yet my answer is no, an AI is not conscious. It is made of mental states, but it does not have a differentiated, separate inner life from the rest of the world, separate from the rest of the world.
Okay, so the inner life is more of a structural thing. So does that mean there should be some kind of moral obligation as we're building transformers to make sure that we avoid giving something the right kind of potential loops or whatever it would take to recognize its own inner life, because then we'd have to kind of worry about its like mental states?
I think right now we have no reason to treat an AI as a conscious being. None at all. I think an AI is a close equivalent to a nuclear power station. That's how we should treat it. It's just as a tool like any other. And I don't think there is any perspective that in the foreseeable future we will have reasons to think otherwise. If you look at how the scaling laws are being applied to transformers, they do not entail recursion. They do not entail all these reentrant loops that you have in brain anatomy. So an AI is ontological dust, as Julia would say, or a single neuron in the mind of nature. Would you be worried if I went into your brain right now and killed one neuron? You wouldn't. Hardly anything would change for you. As a matter of fact, we lose a few thousand neurons every day. They die every day. And we don't care. Would you mind if I reached into your brain with a microscopic probe and I removed one neurotransmitter cell in one of your synaptic clefts? Just removed it. No, you wouldn't mind. You would not notice it. It's too small a disturbance to be registered. So in the same way, if you turn off an AI in the mind of nature, nothing would happen. And the AI, insofar as we can ascertain, has no mind of its own because there isn't enough integrated information in there to say this is a complex that has a private conscious inner life of its own, separate from the rest of nature.
Wow. Thinking this much about kind of the mechanism of what consciousness's boundaries are, does it change your views on death? Do you fear it maybe less than you think the people around you?
Oh, I fear more. Well,
More?
I fear more than I used to because when I was a young man working at CERN in Switzerland, I was a physicalist, not because I thought it through, but because everybody around me was a physicalist. So, well, I just felt, yeah, I'm a physicalist, right? We are studying physical stuff here at CERN. I did not fear death then because, well, we all know when we die, there's nobody there to experience what happens afterwards, right? That there is nothing literally to be fearful of because there is no one there to have the fear. So I thought death is just like turning off the lights. There is an English poet, I forgot his name, who said, if death is there, I am not. If I am there, death is not. So there is literally nothing to fear under physicalism. Under analytic idealism, there is, because death is a drastic change in our state of consciousness from a dissociated, clustered, individuated mental complex to a complex without boundaries that sort of dissolves into the broader mind of nature. And we will experience that under analytic idealism. The subjectivity behind my eyes will experience that. It won't be Bernardo Kastrup, but it is the same subjectivity that is looking to the world from behind my eyes right now. I will be there to experience it, and I don't know what it will feel like. And you bet I fear it much more now than I used to.
Wow. And do you think we'd ever be able to simulate the whole thing? Like, do you see a future where, I know you said before we're pretty far away from something with an inner life, but do you see eventually us getting to a point where you could live on with the same consciousness, but on something like silicon instead of in your biological brain?
I think the subjectivity behind my eye is the subjectivity behind your eyes. It's
Like,
clustered differently, so we mistakenly take on a temporary sense of identity associated with our current state of mind, the current body structure. But I think everybody going through death will say, oh my God, I thought I was that guy, but turn out I'm not. I am the witness behind the inner life of that guy, and I'm still here. So from that perspective, this is a problem you don't need to solve. It's built into the fabric of nature. The subjectivity behind your eyes, not Dylan, not the particular configuration you call Dylan, a different dream avatar, but that subjectivity continues. So there is no engineering problem here to be solved. It's how nature works. The spirit of your question might have been, will this identification with Dylan survive? And the answer is no. And then you might ask, well, how do I make it survive? Well, I think once you are no longer Dylan, you will not care about continuing to be Dylan. But while you are Dylan, you care, right? It's like when we dream, we think we are our dream avatar, separate from the rest of the dream, separate from the houses and the trees and the cars and the other people in the dream. When we wake up, that dissociative state that makes us identify with only a part of the tapestry of mind that we actually are, that dissociative state ends when you wake up. In other words, your dream avatar is dead the moment you wake up. He's toast, he's gone. But you don't mourn the death of your dream avatar because when you wake up, you realize, oh, I was the whole dream. The dream was something I was doing. My dream avatar was not me. It was something I was doing, and now I'm not doing anymore. And I think in reality, it's very analogous. This dissociative state of highly integrated information that you call Dylan and I call Bernardo comes to an end. But I don't think the subjectivity that is experiencing that state cares very much whether you're Dylan or Bernardo. So the question is, if you wake up, would you like to keep on dreaming from the perspective of the same dream avatar? If you are the dream avatar, you sure care about it because you think you are your dream avatar. And if that guy over there wakes up, you're toast and you care about that. But of course, it's a wish derived from delusion, derived from that temporary dissociative state we call dreaming.
Yeah, it's a wish from inside the box that you're contained in. So that's why you can't think bigger than it.
Yeah.
So what if we do start thinking bigger than our brain? Like imagine something like Neuralink where we are tapping into partial thinking through the brain, but partially some of it's going over Wi-Fi and being computed on Elon's supercomputer and then put back in our brain, and the result is some kind of mix between the two.
That has always happened. This is not new. Look, I have spectacles. For the ones listening, I'm pulling out my spectacles now. These spectacles change my experience. If I take them out, you become a blur. If I put them on, oh, I have the experience of seeing Dylan. These enhancements that connect in some way to our nervous system have always been there. Prosthetics, phones that allow you to talk from a distance, clothes that keep you warm, and stuff like Neuralink causes that integration to come closer to the center or to entail a higher bandwidth of data transfers. But there is nothing fundamentally different happening here than wearing spectacles. It's not a difference of category, it's a difference of degree.
I see. That's a good way to put it. So I wouldn't actually be so integrated that it would feel like Dylan having a thought. It would just be a closer, or like, yeah, I see what you mean with the objects. How about free will? Like, do you sort of, where do you sort of fall on that, or how do you interpret that question when people ask you, like, do you believe in free will?
Most people ask this question on a physicalist context, meaning you have free will if your decisions are not determined by your brain activity. And if your decisions are not determined by your brain activity, then you do have free will. Well, framed this way, I would say, well, then obviously we do have free will because brain activity does not determine our choices. Brain activity is what our choices look like. And when people come up with those experiments that say that, you get an increase of potentials in the brain before somebody reports making a choice, that only means that the metacognition of that choice comes after the choice is made. You make a choice and only then do you register to yourself or you tell yourself, I have made that choice. So under analytic idealism, brain activity does not determine your choices. Brain activity is what your choices look like when observed from the outside. They are the extrinsic appearance, the image projected by your inner mental activity. But if you ask me more fundamentally, outside physicalism, is there free will? Then I would ask you the following. What is the semantic space between determinism and randomness where you can place free will? Because when we say free will, we don't mean that our choices are determined, because otherwise it wouldn't be free. But we also don't mean that our choices are random, because otherwise it wouldn't be will. And the problem is there is nothing in between randomness and determination. If your choices are not random, then they are determined by something. Now, you may say, well, if my choices are determined by my preferences, my wishes, my plans, my dispositions, then it's free choices. Okay, then we have free will. But those choices are still determined by your preferences, by your dispositions, by your tastes. And who determines your preferences, your tastes, and your dispositions? Well, nature. Your choices are determined by that which you are. I personally do not believe there is true randomness in nature. I think when we say that individual microscopic quantum events are truly random, what we are saying is we haven't figured out what the pattern is, and we can't predict them. But to then say this means that there is true randomness in nature is to say that because monkeys haven't figured out how it works and can't predict it, therefore it's got to
It's
be
random.
random. Randomness as a concept to me means simply a lack of understanding. Something is random when we don't understand what is actually happening. I don't think anything in nature is truly random, even though we may not be able to figure out how it all works in the primate form we have right now. So from this deeper perspective, I think free will is a red herring. We don't know what you're talking about when we ask the question. The concept is a red herring. Um, everything is determined by what the universe is, by what nature is. What nature is determines what it does. It cannot be otherwise, I think.
Yeah, I mean, from what I understand, I think Einstein would have agreed with you. He always talked about pilot wave theory or something just making sense underneath reality that we just haven't figured out yet. Um, Maybe we could talk about the laws of physics then, as long as we're here, because I can kind of imagine how something like IIT gives you mental states and things exist. They're permanent when you're not around, but somehow it feels like the laws of physics are a little bit different, like gravity, time. Can we call those mental states that have built up into those laws of physics, or are they somehow different in your theory or
Well,
in your conversation?
in science, what we call laws, we use the word law as a very poor metaphor. And science does not say that nature follows any fixed laws determined by decree. What we call laws are observable regularities in nature. If I hold a ball in my hand and then I open my hand, the ball, every time I look, falls down instead of falling up. And that regularity, we give a name to it. We say it's gravity, and then metaphorically we say it's a law. But there is no ontic status to the word law, meaning there is nothing like a law in nature. There is only repeated observations of regular behaviors that seem to be self-consistent over time. In other words, laws are in fact regularities of nature's behavior. From the perspective of analytic idealism and IIT, these regularities are completely understandable. Nature is what it is, and therefore it behaves the way it does. If it would behave in a way that is inconsistent with itself, then there would be meta regularities because nature is what it is. It's not something other than it is. So what it is should determine the regularities of its behavior at whatever level of abstraction we need to look at them. What nature does, the so-called laws of gravity, the laws of classical physics, the law of quantum mechanics, the laws of cosmology, these are just our descriptions of the regularities of behavior of the mental states that constitute nature.
And what are your thoughts on entropy? Does that fit into anything that you've thought about? It seems like this, I mean, it's not a law, I guess, but it seems like predictive. And I've heard people say that's potentially why time feels like it's moving forward as we're just sort of moving towards disorder. Do any of those play into your thoughts?
Well, entropy is a difficult idea in physics. There is a modern criticism that says, well, what we understand for entropy, like degrees of order and or disorder, in fact, higher entropy is lower entropy is a degree of disorder. That understanding is flawed. It has to do with access to information. What we mistake to be a change in the level of entropy only means that you are not occupying a perspective that gives you access to that information. So you think that information is lost and that chaos has increased or organization has decreased. Let me give you an example. In high school physics, teachers often use the example of if you have a cup that's half filled with coffee and another cup which is half filled with milk, and I say, well, when you mix the two, the degree of disorder increases because you cannot unmix coffee from milk once you have mixed them. So there was order before, milk was here, coffee was there. And after you mix them, there is disorder because you can't distinguish milk from coffee anymore. Even that is a very arbitrary thought experiment, because if you were the size of a molecule, say you are the size of a hydrogen molecule, and you're doing a ski slalom. You know, slalom and ski, when you're going downhill, and the blue flag has to be on one side and the red flag on the other. And if you take a trajectory in which this is not the case, then you're disqualified. Right? And the Winter Olympics in Italy are going to start shortly. If you were a hydrogen molecule in that cup of mixed coffee with milk, and you were doing the slalom, and you're walking in such a way that always to your left there is a milk molecule, and always to your right there is a coffee molecule, and then you would trace your trajectory, and you would say that trajectory is a boundary, then milk is perfectly separate from coffee. They never mix at the microscopic scale. There is always a boundary where they are perfectly separated. And so why do we say
It's a
coffee
complex
mixed with
boundary.
milk has different entropy than the initial state? It's because of perspective and access to information. When we lose access to information, we say disorder increased, but that's an epistemic position. There's nothing ontic about it. There's nothing in reality that grounds this. What grounds this is access to information. In other words, our ability to know what's going on.
So fascinating. So what are some of the like things that you've had to really unlearn, and like what was the hardest thing for you to unlearn thinking about this that didn't seem natural? And like, can you walk me through kind of the steps that kind of that path looked like?
I had to unlearn that the correlations between brain states and mental states is not a causative one. Because I always had the tendency to think, well, if there is a fantastic correlation between what I feel and decide or think and measurable patterns of brain activity inside my head, then that correlation should be causative. Those patterns of brain activity should be causing my mental states. And I had to understand that, and this is trite, it's a cliche almost, but I was vulnerable to that cliche. Correlation is not causation, at least not one particular type of causation. If there is a correlation between A and B, it could be that A causes B, or B causes A, or C causes A and B. So having to sort of every time take a step back to reapproach the correlations that I observe empirically was something I had to discipline myself in my 20s to do. Today, I don't have that problem anymore. Another thing I had to learn was to decouple the concept of mentation from the concept of biology.
Sorry, say that again. What with biology? Augmentation?
Mentation. Decouple the concept of a mental state from the concept of a biological state. Because since we sort of grow up in a culture of physicalism, we take many of the assumptions of physicalism for granted as if they were facts, because we don't examine those assumptions. And don't take me wrong, it's perfectly normal what you did, but you did this in the beginning of this interview when you asked me if the world is made of mental states. Well, whose mental states are they? And that has to do with this association, instinctive but culturally learned association we make between mental states and biological states. If there are mental states, there has to be a living creature that owns those mental states, that produces those mental states. This is a physicalist assumption. It's understandable because the only things that can communicate the inner presence of mental states are living beings that evolved to communicate. So we only have access to mental states beyond ourselves when they are communicated to us by other living beings. Nature at large is not telling us, oh, look, I'm having a mental state here. It didn't evolve to do that. It doesn't need to do that. It just is. But we misinterpreted this correlation for a fundamental aspect of nature, which instinctively tells us that, oh, mental states have to belong to a living creature. And that's what causes a lot of the incongruences and insoluble problems of our metaphysics today. This idea that there cannot be non-biological mental states. And in fact, that all states of nature can be mental states, and there is absolutely nothing incoherent about it whatsoever. Nothing that requires the existence of a category that we don't already know exists. We know mental states exist. We know they correlate to physical states. And we know that my mental inner life appears to the outside as patterns of material or physical brain activity. Just extrapolate that. The inner life of nature also appears as physical stuff. And so by breaking this culture-bound association, many seeming problems just disappear. Things become so much simpler, more logical, coherent, and demanding less leaps of faith, much closer to the empirical grounding of our life experience.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of thoughts there. Yeah, it just makes me feel so ethereal thinking about that. Okay, so if all the scientists just kind of started embracing idealism, like what kind of questions would we start asking? Like what kind of experiments would we start running? What kind of changes would we make to society?
Well, I don't think analytic idealism invalidates any established science, because science is the study of what nature does. When you set up an experiment, you're asking nature, what will you do next under these circumstances? And nature replies by providing an experimental outcome. Something happens when you run the experiment, and that's your answer. And the whole point of science is to predict what nature will do next. Nothing science does has anything directly to do with what nature is, because we cannot access directly what nature is. All we can do is predict what it will do, because what it will do are the observables, not what it is. So whether you adopt physicalism or analytic idealism, nature still does what it does. And if we did good science in the past, that good science still holds. Doesn't become invalidated because we changed our metaphysics. In other words, because we changed our view of what nature is. Only if you hold a view about what nature is that excludes certain behaviors, and those behaviors are observed, okay, you just invalidated your metaphysics. And I submit to you that this is exactly what happened to physicalism. Nature has invalidated physicalism. We don't accept that. We try to create, the meta loops to try to save our metaphysics and come up with all kinds of almost embarrassingly implausible conjectures to save physicalism from the cusps of empirical science. But science, good science already done in the past, remains good science under analytic idealism. There is still a world out there beyond our minds. It is mental, but it's not our mentation. It's separate and independent of us. That stays the same. What would change is that there are certain scientific hypotheses that we do not investigate because we think we already know the answer. For instance, we think if our mental states are produced by activity inside our skull, and our skull is, of course, a hermetically sealed space, not even a photon goes in from the outside, then there cannot be such a thing as telepathy. And therefore, very few people truly study telepathy because it cannot be true under physicalism. If you change your metaphysics, then these prejudices or these prejudgments change, and some of them disappear altogether. So we will start looking at things that we didn't look closely enough at before. And I, for one, think telepathy is absolutely natural and common, because if everything is mental states, then nature is effectively one field of mentation, one big mind, and this sense of separation we have, it's because of the particular dissociative configuration of mental states that we call life, that looks like biology. But no process in nature is perfect, right? When you set fire to something, not everything that is combustible actually combusts. When rain stops, not all humidity in the air dries up and disappears. No process in nature is perfect. Why would dissociation be? The dissociative state that characterizes the privateness of my inner life and my inability to send a thought across the world may not be perfect. It may be porous. It may be permeable. And that porosity can increase or decrease depending on how you eat, how you behave, what drugs you take. So I am very open-minded about uh, um, a commerce of mental states, a very low volume commerce of mental states across dissociative boundaries. And I don't think there is anything unnatural at all about it. It doesn't shock me at all. It doesn't make me go, oh wow, how can this be? No, it's like, yeah, duh.
Like it
you
could
know,
be. Yeah.
no big deal. So so what? But if we live under a metaphysics that understands this, what we will do next is how do we figure out a way to exploit it to our own advantage? That is what will change.
Yeah. I mean, I will say the telepathy comment caught me off guard. I mean, maybe it's because of like the world, the assumptions I have about the world, but you probably are you thinking about telepathy in like a more broad sense, or you actually think maybe I could send a thought to somebody?
Well, I don't think of telepathy as something that's deliberate, because I have seen instances in my life in which I would have to be extremely prejudiced to dismiss as an instance of telepathy. I can give you an example if you'd
Okay.
like to hear. These things usually don't happen to me. I'm very hard-headed. I'm very much in my baseline state of consciousness. It's very difficult to move me off the baseline. But my partner, we were years ago. We were on holidays, off the grid somewhere in Germany, really off the grid, and we were out of contact with family and friends for a week. We were literally off the grids. We were going to caves. Um, and one day she woke up in the morning. I was already awake, and she told me, "Oh, I had this funny dream. I dreamed that my grandmother was in hospital with a bandage around her head, and my two aunts were sitting on her bed next to her, one to each side of hers. And nobody moved, nobody said anything, but I had this thought as if my grandmother were telling me something, and she said, I am okay." And then she asked me, because she knows I am into Jungian psychology. And then she asked me, what do you make of it? What does it tell you about me? She asked. And I realized that this was a very peculiar dream. Dreams of a static image without happenings, without movements, are
Yeah.
very, very rare. Dreams tend to sort of play out
Like
a
morph and
symbolic.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I had this intuition and I told her, call your father. And she looked at me funny, like, why? I said, just call your father. Ask how your grandmother is doing. So she picked up the phone and called her father. Now, she was asleep before. I know for a fact that she couldn't have known what her father told her then, which was, your grandmother had a stroke in her head. She is in the hospital right now, but the doctor told us that she's out of danger, and my sisters are with her. I I almost fell off my
Wow.
chair. Now, and this happened overnight when she was asleep, for a fact. And there was nothing that would lead to the expectation that she was going to have a stroke. And the specificity of the details were such that I can't maintain my intellectual honesty and tell you that, yeah, it's just one of those things. I'm not that
Yeah.
blunt an instrument, if you know what
No,
I
I
mean.
know what you mean. That's
But
pretty much
I'll tell
impossible
you
to
this.
ignore.
Yeah, but I tell you this. It was entirely natural to me because at that point I had already thought these things through, so I didn't find it an instance of magic or a miracle to me it was like, yeah, okay, having a stroke is emotionally a very charged state. Charged states are the ones that are most reactive, most susceptible to sort of reacting with their environment, just like a chemical that is reactive. and her grandmother and my partner were emotionally very linked. In mind space, there is no space time. Mind space is a cognitive space. It's a space of semantic associations, not the distances. So distance means nothing in mind space. Distance is something we create to represent information about the world, or space, and that my partner would have picked up the mental state of her grandmother in such an emotionally charged situation, I thought perfectly natural, understandable, nothing to write home about. And I think civilizations prior to ours would have also thought the same. Yeah, duh, yeah, this is how it works. It's just that we are culturally bound to make assumptions that are not grounded in empirical evidence or reality or even good theory when it comes to metaphysics. So we become googly-eyed. We become, oh my God, look at this, amazing. And you write home about it. you know,
Right. It does seem
that's
like a lot of our ancestors or
yeah,
civilizations would have been like, yeah, that's, they believed in a lot of
yeah,
stuff that seems crazy to us. So,
yeah. It's like seeing the sunrise. Yeah, it happens. So what?
yeah. All right. Well, we only have a couple minutes left. So I thought maybe we could end by I wanted to ask you kind of like what you recommend people read or watch. And then also let's talk about what you're up to and anything you'd like to share with the audience about your work.
Oh, I'm not really the guy to tell people what to do. I'm not the 7 steps to
Mm-hmm.
philosophical enlightenment
But is
guy.
there some authors or scientists or people who have inspired you that you might want to mention?
Well, there are things I enjoy and I find insightful. Look, I run a foundation called Essentia Foundation, and we publish um, materials, scientific or philosophical material, very highly curated, related to idealism, metaphysics, mind, philosophy of mind, and all that. So what you see on the website of Essentia Foundation is the stuff I personally find very interesting and credible to a minimum extent. So if people want to have a look at some of my interests and the interests of the people who work with me at Essentia Foundation, you can just go to essentiafoundation.org. Essentia with a T at the end. Essentiafoundation.org.
Okay, that's a great place to leave it. I just want to say thank you for spending so much time with me today, and I had a wonderful conversation. I hope the audience gets a lot out of it too. Thank you.
I enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me, Dylan.